If you're looking at buying a new higher-end Roland module, you might be struggling to decide between the Roland TD-27 and the TD-50. The TD-50 is the current Roland flagship, so you would think that it should be the best value that money could buy, right? So why does the TD-27 seem so similar and even have extra features at a lower price? And are there any reasons that the TD-50 would still be the right choice? Let's take a look. Hey, welcome back to the eDrum Workshop. I'm Luke and I hope you're having a great day. I personally think that the Roland TD-27 offers a lot of value for a mid-range Roland module, but there are certain applications that the TD-50 is much more suited for that you just won't get out of a TD-27 module. So if you want to know which of these two modules would be the better choice for you and your needs, I'm going to compare the sounds and the features to help you find out which one is the right fit. So first off, the sounds. The TD-50 and the TD-27 are both based on the same sound engine, and there's a lot of sonic similarities between the two. If you're into heavily tweaking your sounds, then both of these modules do a very good job of that with a lot of options to offer. And if you build kits to a similar specification on both modules, you might not notice that much difference between them. Now, in terms of pure numbers, the TD-27 actually outclasses the TD-50. The TD-27 has 728 sounds compared to the 50's 422. This appears mostly to be because of the inclusion of both TD-50 instruments and TD-17 instruments, which are based on a completely different set of samples. The first set of each of the acoustic category of instruments are basically the TD-50 instruments, though they do have different names. Sometimes there's two variations of each one, like a fat and an open or a light version, and they aren't always at the exact same starting pitch, or there's other slight differences. For most purposes though, they are effectively the same. Following these, you get to the instruments that come from the TD-17. You can actually tell which ones these are by the fact that they have some parameters unavailable. For example, there's no overtone option on the TD-17 sample snares, and no low level and low decay options on the TD-17 soundset kick drums. These missing parameters don't really make a huge difference, and the sounds overall are still much more flexible than in the TD-17 because there's extra options available. There are also some quick edit knobs on the front of the module, which give you faster access to the most used settings like the instrument, the volume, the tuning, and the muffling of each pad, which are really handy. So the TD-50 sound set actually feels a little bit limited in comparison. Some of those TD-17 instruments are actually pretty beefy and they're really well rounded, so they actually add a lot to the 27's instrument library. On the flip side, when you play these two modules side by side, there is actually a noticeable extra punch, clarity and overall fullness to the TD-50 sounds that I've just not been able to get out of the TD-27. Also, I personally just find that I prefer the cymbal sounds in the TD-50. To me, they just feel much fuller and wider even when you strip down all the settings. Both modules allow you to layer two sounds on every available pad zone in the module using the main and sub instrument settings. They also allow the import of user samples. You can add these as one-shot instruments or layers to blend with other sounds. The other main difference differences in the approach to tweaking instruments and kits are the way that the microphone controls are set up and the ambience settings. The TD-50 has microphone controls under the instrument settings. You can choose how close or distant the virtual microphones are from each individual drum or cymbal, and how much overhead and room mic there is for each individual instrument, as well as the width of those virtual mics. The TD-27 takes a completely different approach with its new workflow, something that I'll get onto shortly, and the introduction of the overhead settings. These are basically a set of virtual overhead microphones emulating what you would use on a mic'd up acoustic kit, and there's the ability to tweak these very heavily. You get different mic type options and the same kind of distance and width options found in the TD-50 mic settings, the ability to use up to 4 different routable filters, overhead EQ, compression and limiter settings, and send settings to control how much of each instrument is sent to the overheads. I really like this setup because it gives you a lot of different options to tweak around your kit, and there's also a bunch of template presets available to you if you don't want to fine tune it yourself. So back on the TD-50, the ambience settings are actually handled quite differently. The most notable part of this being the dedicated ambience slider. Since even the TD-17 has an ambience knob, this is something that I really miss on the TD-27. Also, on the TD-50 there are 2 dedicated ambiences, a room and a reverb, along with a stereo enhancer. These give you a good level of flexibility to model a room around your kit and then add additional reverb if you want to. This is all sort of rolled into one on the TD-27, which gives you the room setting, where you can choose either a modelled room or a reverb, and then the overheads option sort of chips in towards the ambience depending on your settings. These 2 approaches are just different. I don't necessarily think one is better than the other. The TD-27's approach is more streamlined and it's simpler to get your head around for newer users, whereas the TD-50 gives you more options overall and actually creates a bit more depth around the kit. I was also quite surprised when I first started using the 27 by just how many of the 50's different sound processing options are in there. It's got the same sound shaping tools, a transient designer, pad EQ, pad compression, 3 assignable multi-effects processors, master compression and master EQ. So they're actually on equal footing there. And then when it comes to the workflow, this is where I think that the TD-27 really shines. When you open the kit edit menu, you're greeted with a visual representation of all of the controls that you've got menus for, with the ability to turn them on or off without entering the specific menus. It's a great way of showing you how each option will affect the sound and how they might also affect the next step along in the process. On the TD-50, the menus feel more separated from each other, you've got a lot of going up and down the pages, and it doesn't always feel like every option placement is completely logical. The TD-27 has clearly been designed around ease of use, whereas the TD-50 is a bit more about having quick access to each function, but then you working the rest out yourself. Both of these approaches are valid, but one is definitely simpler to use. So overall, if we were looking at just the sounds, the extra added punch and clarity and some of the additional options on the TD-50 are certainly desirable, but they're not essential. And the similarities between the 2 modules don't end there. They're both compatible with the Roland digital pads as well. There are 3 USB ports on both modules, though at the moment there's only 2 Roland digital pads, the PD-140DS snare and the CY18DR ride, and they both have equal functionality on both modules. The rest of the analog pads that I've personally tried have all triggered as well between both modules. They can both also use MIDI over USB to control drum software or VSTs, and I've found the performance of both to be pretty much identical here too, with the only real difference being the number of triggers that you can plug in. So things are looking pretty great for the TD-27. It's as playable as the TD-50, it's got more internal sounds, and if you were thinking of mostly using VSTs, there's not really a great deal of reason to plump for the 50 over the 27. If, however, you do want to use this module outside of purely home and headphone use and you don't want to involve a laptop, it does become a bit of a different story. Part of that is because that extra added punch and clarity to the sound that I mentioned translates well to a big PA, but it's also because other differences in functionality are going to dictate whether you would choose one over the other. As mentioned, the 2 modules are clearly designed with different end users in mind. The TD-50 is a much bigger module with more options available from button presses, with plenty of faders and knobs to quickly adjust volumes of instruments, backing tracks from the song player, the metronome and the ambience. It's visually quite complex and you can get a bit lost in the menus at times, but it is very robust with features. And it's also more robust physically. The module casing is much more solid, the buttons are a harder plastic compared to the TD-27 soft rubber buttons, and the connections all feel more solid on the back. The TD-27 feels much cheaper in the hand. It's pretty light and the plastic plastic casing doesn't feel that durable. It's also geared more towards simplicity on the face of the module too, with the quick edit functions that I mentioned before, the song player, click, coach and drum kit buttons all handily placed around the middle dial, quick multifunction buttons for page navigation, and some simple menu and function buttons over to the right. A personal gripe for me actually is the way that these buttons are laid out. I find myself going into the user sample menu a lot expecting the up arrow to be here, so here's how I would prefer it was laid out. However, it is a tiny point and you might have no issues with it. The inputs and outputs are going to be another defining factor on whether you would pick one of these modules over the other if you need them. The TD-27 uses a cable snake for the majority of the trigger inputs, which some people don't mind. I personally don't have a big issue with them if you're just using it at home, but I wouldn't be that happy about using them at a live show. There's always the worry of one cable in the snake failing. These cable looms are not cheap, so carrying a spare one in case of failure is a much bigger deal than having a few spare jack cables. However, if you do have the digital snare and ride, they'll be handled by the USB inputs, and there are still 4 jack inputs on the 27 module for the Crash 2 and 3 auxiliary pads. The TD-50 has the same USB ports and then individual jack inputs for every other pad, plus 2 additional inputs, the Tom 4 and the 4th AUX input. It's not a huge amount of additional inputs, but those individual jacks are much better for professional use and just for the purpose of spares. The TD-50 has a stereo pair of master output jacks, plus 8 direct outputs too, which gives you a lot more flexibility with routing. On top of that, there are also XLR master outputs, which are handy if you don't need the other outputs, but you want to run the kit on stage without a DI box. The TD-27 has a stereo pair of master outputs plus 2 direct outputs. You still get access to the same kind of routing screen as on the 50, so you could opt to send out your kick and snare direct, and then a stereo mix of the toms, cymbals and effects, or you could treat all 4 outputs as individual outputs and send 4 mono mixes. So the TD-27 could still work well for some people's gigs, especially the smaller ones. But if you need that additional flexibility for your usage, then this is where the value proposition swaps round. There just isn't that much control for routing on the TD-27. One place where weirdly the TD-27 is much more flexible is when you're using the USB outputs over a computer as an interface. The TD-27 gives you 28 audio outputs over USB, whereas the TD-50 only gives you 10. It's nice to have all of those additional channels if you do want to use your Roland sounds in recordings, but to be honest, I don't think that would be a deal breaker for most people. Other minor functionality differences come in the form of different menu options and settings. For example, the copy menu in the TD-50 is hugely robust and lets you copy all kinds of different settings from other kits or menus. The TD-27 also has some functionality that the TD-50 doesn't have: Bluetooth compatibility and the coach functions. It's a shame that the Bluetooth wasn't introduced until the TD-17, so the TD-50 doesn't have it, but for me personally it's not a deal breaker. And the coach mode is a staple on lower end Roland modules. It gives you some training exercises to play along with a metronome. Again, it's a great function especially for beginners or those who want to challenge their timing, but I can see why it's not prioritised for professional flagship use. There's probably some other minor functionality between the two that I've glossed over, but I think that these were the main things that would influence people's buying decisions. Your personal needs and usage are going to be the deciding factors on which of these two modules are best for you. If you're using the module entirely at home or for some small gigs, you want simplicity, plenty of sounds, and you can overlook things like cable snakes and don't need all of the functionality, the TD-27 will most likely fit all of your needs, and I think that's going to apply to the majority of people that are picking between these two modules. The bulk of the features and functionality from the TD-50 are there, and the sound set is kind of the best of both worlds between the TD-50 and the TD-17. So that's why overall I think that the TD-27 offers the best value proposition for the bulk of average consumers. However, the TD-50 is still worth it for those people that need the flexibility that it affords. If you need a more solid module, you need those extra outputs, those extra inputs and the individual jacks for them, the additional punch and clarity from the sounds and all those extra little detailed features. These will be the invaluable differences that make the TD-50 the right choice for you. Now more than ever, you are admittedly paying quite a premium for those additional features just because of how much they put into the TD-27, but it still offers a lot of functionality if it's what you're looking for, and you can still create a great wealth of sounds from the onboard sounds or importing your own samples. If you want more examples of what either of these two modules can do, or even TD-17 and Pearl Mimic Pro modules, then check out my store at thedrumworkshop.com or other videos on this channel. Some of those kits were used in the demonstrations on this video, but there's plenty more more available and definitely plenty more to come. So what did you think of my analysis of these two modules? Is there anything else you'd want to know about either of them for your usage? Do you have experience with either of them, and if so, which one do you prefer? Let me know down in the comments. If you own either module already and you want more kits, don't forget to check out my store, and why not pop a like on the video and subscribe if you haven't already. It really helps the channel out. Enjoy the rest of your day, and I'll see you in the next video. Cheers!